Welcome to the Tadaima Book Club discussion of John Okada's No Boy with Frank Abe. My name is Vince Schleitwiler. I'm a yonsei from Chicago, currently living in Seattle's Beacon Hill. I teach Japanese American Studies and Comparative Ethnic Studies at the University of Washington. So we're here today with Frank Abe to talk about No Boy, the beloved novel by John Okada about the consequences of Japanese American incarceration, and particularly about how the question of loyalty and of military service tore the community apart, tore families and individuals apart, and left wounds that to this day are still healing. The novel's had a long and complex afterlife since its publication in 1957, its republication in the 1970s, and its republication last year in a controversial edition that's since been withdrawn. Every decade or so, writers or readers rediscover this book and make it. As our conversation goes on, I think we're going to talk about some of the new ways the book is resonating these days. In the face of widespread protests over family separation, migrant detention, mass incarceration, the violence inflicted on Black people by the state in the name of justice, or just generally what it means to wake up one day to the fact that racism and white supremacy has managed to convince you to accept as true all kinds of things about yourself and about the world, and about what it means to be guilty or innocent that are just manifestly not true. So we'll have a lot to talk about. But we'll begin today with a presentation by Frank Abe, who has been possibly this book's most energetic reader since the 1970s, and whose dogged research on Okada's own biography has given the novel back to readers as the product both of a remarkable life and a remarkable community. If I went through all of Frank's accomplishments as a filmmaker, journalist, literary historian, activist, and writer, that might take up our whole program. Frank is a legend. So fortunately, you can check out his bio online, but I do want to mention just a couple of things. Frank recently won an American Book Award for John Okada, the life and rediscovered work of the author of No Boy from the University of Washington Press. He's made the film Conscience and Constitution, an award-winning PBS documentary on the largest organized resistance to the incarceration of Japanese Americans. He's also collaborating on a new graphic novel on camp resistance called We Hereby Refuse, and an anthology for Penguin Classics on the literature of Japanese American incarceration, both due out in 2021. Frank is also, for many of us, literally the face of No Boy. So if you grew up as I did with either the 1976 Carp edition of the book, rediscovered by Jeffrey Chan, Frank Chin, Lawson Inada, and Sean Wong, or the reprints that were available from UW Press from the late 70s until they put out a fancy new edition in 2014, then the handsome face looking out at you on the cover illustration is, it turns out, based on a photograph of a young actor by the name of Frank Abe. So I love this story so much, I always try to make Frank tell it. Maybe we can share that story, Frank?
Well, thank you, Vince, for that kind introduction. I want to correct one thing that I really, the most energetic reader since the 70s, maybe since the 2000s, but I really do stand on the shoulders of the original editors of IE and the Combined Asian American Resources Project. And you mentioned the book cover. This is the cover that Frank Chin, Lawson Inada, Sean Wong, and Jeff Chan produced out of their own pockets to republish No Boy in 1976. The cover, it's true, and this is the original cover, by the way, Vince. You'll see that the idea from designer Bob Onodera was to have a red flag in the left eye and the red, white, and blue on the right side. Unfortunately, the blue got left out of later editions just as a cost-saving measure. So this is the cover that you knew and you grew up with, as you say. This is the design that, without the flags in the eyes, that was created by a guy named Bob Onodera in San Francisco. And it's a little more recognizable as being based on a photograph of myself from the Asian American Theater Workshop back in 75, 76. So that's the story on that. So today we are talking about No No Boy, and I want to pose the question, John Okada was a Nisei veteran of the Military Intelligence Service. And one question that comes to mind is, how did a Nisei veteran of the MIS come to write a classic American novel about a Nisei draft resistor? Ideally, we'd be speaking together, gathered in a room. And, Vince, you and I are like a mile apart because I live in Mount Baker, you live in Beacon Hill here in Seattle. But online, the energy is different. So what I want to do is take just a few minutes to read the first 3 pages of the novel, then take 15 minutes to talk about what went into the construction of the novel, and then stop and get to the book club discussion. And I think that people can leave questions in the chat room as we go along. We can circle back to pick them up in about 20 minutes. So this is how John Okada opens his novel with chapter 1. And again, this is a Nisei veteran writing this about, well, you'll see. Chapter 1. 2 weeks after his 25th birthday, Ichiro got off a bus at 2nd and Main in Seattle. He'd been gone 4 years, 2 in camp and 2 in prison. Walking down the street that autumn morning with a small black suitcase, he felt like an intruder in a world to which he had no claim. It was just enough that he should feel this way, for, of his own free will, he had stood before the judge and said that he would not go in the army. At the time, there was no other choice for him. That was when he was 23, a man of 23. Now, 2 years older, he was even more of a man. Christ, he thought to himself, just a goddamn kid is all I was. Didn't know enough to wipe my own nose. What the hell am I doing? What am I doing back here? Best thing I could do would be to kill some son of a bitch and head back to prison. He walked toward the railroad depot where the tower with the clocks on all 4 sides was. It was a dirty-looking tower of ancient brick. It was a dirty city. Dirtier, certainly, than it had a right to be after only 4 years. Waiting for the light to change to green, he looked around at the people standing at the bus stop. A couple of men in suits, half a dozen women who failed to arouse him even after prolonged good behavior, and a young Japanese with a lunch bucket. Ichiro studied him, searching with his mind for the name that went with the round, pimply face and the short cropped hair. The pimples were gone, and the face had hardened, but the hair was still cropped. The fellow wore green army fatigue trousers and an Eisenhower jacket. Eto Minato. The name came to him at the same time as did the horrible significance of the army clothes. In panic, he started to step off the curb. It was too late. He had been seen. Ichi, that was his nickname. Trying to escape, Ichiro urged his legs frenziedly across the street. Hey, Ichi! The caller's footsteps ran toward him. An arm was placed across his back. Ichiro stopped and faced the other Japanese. He tried to smile, but could not. There was no way out now. I'm Eto, remember? Eto smiled and extended his palm. Reluctantly, Ichiro lifted his own hand and let the other shake it. The round face with the round eyes peered at him through silver-rimmed spectacles. What the hell? It's been a long time, but not that long. How you been? What's doing? Well, that is, last time must have been around before Pearl Harbor, right? God, it's been quite a while, hasn't it? Closer to 4 years, I guess. Lots of Japs coming back to the coast. Lots of Japs in Seattle. You'll see them around. Japs are funny that way. Got to have their rice and sake and other Japs. Stupid, I say. Smart ones went to Chicago, New York, and lots of places back east. But there's still plenty coming back out this way. Eto drew cigarettes from his breast pocket and held up the package. No? Well, I'll have one. Got in the habit in the army. Just got out a short while back. Rough time, but I made it. Didn't get out in time to make the quarter, but I'm planning to go to school. Hey, how long you been around? Ichiro touched his toe with the suitcase. Just got in. Haven't been home yet. When'd you get discharged? The car, grinding its gears, started down the street. He wished you were in it. I never was in. Eto slapped him good-naturedly on the arm. Hey, no need to look so sour. So you weren't in, so what? Been in camp all this time? No. He made an effort to be free of Eto with his questions. He felt as if he were in a small room whose walls were slowly closing in on him. It's been a long time, I know, but I'm really anxious to see the folks. What the hell? Let's have a drink. On me. I don't give a damn if I'm late for work. If I'm late for work. As for your folks, you'll see them soon enough. You drink, don't you? Yeah, but not now. Eto was disappointed. He shifted his lunchbox from under one arm to the other. I really got to be going. The round face wasn't smiling anymore. It was thoughtful. The eyes confronted Ichiro with indecision, which changed slowly to enlightenment and then to suspicion. He remembered. He knew. The friendliness was gone as he said, "No, boy, huh?" Ichiro wanted to say yes. He wanted to return the look of despising hatred and say simply yes, but it was too much to say. The walls had closed in and were crushing all the unspoken words back down into his stomach. He shook his head once, not wanting to evade the eyes, but finding it impossible to meet them. Rotten bastard. Shit on you. Eto coughed up a mouthful of sputum and rolled his words around it. Rotten, no good bastard. Surprisingly, Ichiro felt relieved. Eto's anger seemed to serve as a release to his own naked tensions. As he stooped to lift the suitcase, a wet wad splattered over his hand and dripped onto the black leather. "I'll piss on you next time," said Eto vehemently. So this is how Okada opens his novel. This is the start of Nono Boy, and it gets darker and crazier from there. Nono Boy is the story of Ichiro's alienation from his parents, his friends, and anyone who tries to hire him from a job. And Okada puts the conflict right in our faces from the start, this division in our communities after the camps. So you have to remember that before the war, these characters of Eto Minato and Ichiro Yamada were friends. They talk like old buddies from the same high school. So what happened to divide them? How did they come out of the war on opposite sides? A short answer is simple. There's a difference in how they responded to race prejudice, war hysteria, and the failure of the government to respect their status as American citizens and their rights under the Constitution to due process and equal protection under the law. So the author doesn't beat us around the head with this. You won't find the word Constitution in the text of the novel. I searched. But that is the subtext to every decision Ichiro makes. So let's look at the life of John Okada for some insight into how he constructed this novel. Here's his family, his immigrant parents, 3 brothers, baby sister. And in this picture is something that you and we all take for granted, the idea of birthright citizenship, which some in our government today have talked about revoking. All right? Racial laws barred Yoshito and Takayo Okada from naturalized U.S. citizenship, but the children, all born here in Seattle, so under the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, John and his siblings were automatically American citizens. Parents and children had different legal status, a little like some immigrant families today, with some documented and some undocumented, or like today with families with DACA children born elsewhere but raised here. The Okada family managed the Merchants Hotel, still stands in the corner of First and Yesler in Seattle. This is where John Okada was born in 1923. John's in grade school. The family took over the Yakima Hotel. From there, a short walk to grade school, Bailey Gatzert, where John did not get the memo about wearing a white shirt for class picture day, because that's him in the dark shirt and bolo tie. That's here that he makes 2 lifelong friends, Roy Kumasaka and Frank Ashida. After public school, the Nisei students would troop over to Japanese language school in Seattle. John excelled with the rigor of Japanese school, just as he did at Broadway High School, where the student body was 1/4 Nisei. And when I say that the characters Eto and Ichiro were high school buddies, we can imagine it was at a school like this in Seattle. Okada was 18. Yes, Vince.
Oh, just a quick interruption. You gotta, if you can remove that screen share message on your screen.
Yes, sir. I will hide that. I may not be able to get it back, but I'll hide that. Okada was 18 when he had just started at the University of Washington in fall 1941, when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. So that night in Seattle, he saw the FBI taking away the fathers of his classmates, the ones who were community leaders, on the basis of some connection with our new enemy. So in the last 2 years, a new term entered our vocabulary: family separation. we were all upset to see the US government separating children from their families seeking asylum at the southern border. Well, I believe the Japanese American experience was one of family separation, but in reverse. In our case, it was the fathers, innocent men like Yoshito Okada, who were ripped from their children and wives. Mr. Okada escaped arrest on December 7th, but 2 months later, the FBI made a second sweep on another Sunday morning. And in February 1942, an FBI agent comes to the Yakima Hotel to arrest, take away Yoshito Okada. This was a family separation, and it would eventually inform the heart of Nono Boy. Mr. Okada was held for weeks at the Federal Immigration Detention Center. In March, he and 100 other Issei men were paraded out of King Street Station, the site of the clock tower I just showed you, where, well, on the other side, on the right side, you can see an iron fence and their families crying out to them. Now, the Seattle Times was tipped off to get this picture. And look at the arms of the wives and children reaching out through the iron bars to scream out their goodbyes in Japanese and English. And you can see that's the same scene being played out at the southern border. Somewhere in the darkness on the left side, among those men is Yoshito Okada, and somewhere behind the fence on the right side had to be John Okada and his family, because their hotel is only 2 blocks away from this station. One man in this crowd said, "For the first time, it hit me that I might never see my wife and children again." So the men were put on a train for the Department of Justice camp at Fort Missoula, Montana. The Okadas are bused with 7,000 others to the family detention camp at the Puyallup Fairgrounds, half an hour south of here. The only person to visit them there was one of their hotel boarders, a shipyard watchman who was like a second father to the Okada family. A letter from him vouching for Mr. Okada's good character and loyalty, if you will, helped secure his release after 6 months from Missoula to rejoin the family in Puyallup. Okada called it one of the happiest moments of their lives. As we'll soon see, others were not so lucky. The family was soon moved to the permanent camp in Minidoka, but Okada spends only 3 weeks there. He's among the first students released from camp to attend Scottsbluff Junior College in Nebraska, along with his friends Roy Kumasaka and Frank Ashida. Once their year of school is up, and with the JACL urging the draft for all Nisei, the 3 friends figured the only way for them to stick together is to enlist for the Military Intelligence Service. They're assigned to Camp Savage, Minnesota, to study as Japanese interpreters. So John builds there on the Japanese he learned as a child, and he's ticketed for service in Guam with the Army Air Force's 8th Radio Squadron Mobile, nicknamed the Flying 8-Ball. Their commanding officer successfully argued that if the Army put these Nisei into airplanes and fly them over the Japanese coastline, they could intercept and translate enemy signals in real time. So they need 10 volunteers for an elite team to fly these dangerous missions over the Japanese coastline. And of course, all the Nisei volunteer. John's among the 10 selected. They earn the nickname the Flying Nisei. So as he describes in the preface to Nono Boy, his job is to crawl into the belly of a modified B-24 bomber, put on a pair of headphones, attached to a high-frequency set, and jot down air-ground messages spoken by Japanese pilots to Radio Shacks on the ground. John makes 24 of these dangerous flights in the belly of his modified B-24. From this plane, he sees the beauty of Mount Fuji and the horror of the firebombing of Tokyo in 1945. So after the war ends, John serves as an interpreter with the occupation forces. When he's discharged in 1946, he and the other MIS soldiers are told to keep their mouths shut about their secret operations. He rejoins his family in Seattle's Chinatown, now managing the Pacific Hotel. John returns to the UW, and with his GI Bill, he takes courses in creative writing. His occupation service is not classified, so the first thing he does is write a 1-act satire about it. In a span of 4 months, he publishes 5 short stories in a New Seattle newspaper, and these feel like class exercises he polished for publication. And you can tell Okada he wants to write, but he's not yet found a story that matters. But that changes when a guy named Hajime Jimakutsu, whom he knew from Broadway High School, is released from federal prison. Hajime Jimakutsu had resisted the draft at Minidoka. Jimakutsu tried to sign up for ROTC before the war, was rejected for flat feet. After Pearl Harbor, he even tried again. He resisted the draft because he was mad at the government for reclassifying all the Nisei after Pearl Harbor from 1A to 4C, which is a category for enemy aliens like his father. Jim was mad at losing their home and other property he owned. Jim was mad that his father couldn't rejoin the family in their camp for 2 full years. So Jim was convicted of draft evasion and served 2 years at the federal penitentiary of Neal Island, Washington, which is like an hour's drive south of Seattle. When he gets out, he and John Okada go out to eat and drink at nightclubs like the Wame Club in Chinatown. And this is where the Nisei soldier begins to see a story in the Nisei draft resistor. One reason is the gag order on not disclosing military secrets, but the other is that John Okada wrote about what he saw when he came back to Seattle. And through Akutsu, what he saw was his high school buddies and college buddies who served in the military, all fighting with his buddies who refused the draft on principle. And over drinks, John discovers that he and Jim share the same painful experience of family separation from their fathers. Remember that group of men put in the train to Missoula? Jim's father was in that group of fathers arrested by the FBI. But Jim's father was not as lucky. Mr. Akutsu was held at Fort Missoula for nearly 2 years. When he was finally released back to Minidoka, both father and son had changed so much that neither recognized the other. So again, over drinks at the Wame Club, at a table much like this one, John Okada takes notes as they're drinking as Hajime Jimakutsu spills his story. And when it comes 10 years later to writing his great Nisei novel, the Wame becomes the Club Oriental in the book, and Okada draws his protagonist as a draft resistor. And in the first draft of the book, the character is actually named Hajime, not Ichiro. And John does this, I believe, because in their shared experience of family separation, John Okada could see himself. And Okada could not be more transparent about this. The novel has a preface that I described to you, ending with a scene of the Army enlisted man sitting in the belly of a B-24 and thinking about his friend who didn't volunteer for the Army because, and I quote, his father had been picked up in the second screening after Pearl Harbor. At the end of the preface, the enlisted man thinks about a friend who refused the draft because his father was separated from their family. And then in the transition to chapter 1, the point of view of the novel shifts from the enlisted man at the B-24 to that of his friend in prison, Ichiro Yamada. And in that cinematic dissolve, you can see that the author, who is a soldier, imagining himself in the shoes of a resistor. And Nono Boy can be read as the author acting out the script from there. And Vince, so that's the story of how a Nisei veteran came to write the classic novel of a Nisei draft resistor. What John Okada captures is the soul of a man who knows right from wrong, but does not yet have the language to answer those who would demean him for sticking to his unarticulated principles. That's the short version of Nono Boy, and eager to hear what the book club viewers have to say, but maybe you have some questions too.
Yeah, I do. I think first of all, I want to say hello and welcome to everybody who's out there. I know we have really great attendance for this, so it's exciting to see some familiar names out there. There are a lot of connections that we might explore. For example, for one thing, between this book and the present, we spoke about earlier, right? So you made references to family separation, to detention, to xenophobia. So I thought maybe I'd start with 1 or 2 questions, and I have a question about that, and then we'll sort of start taking some questions from the audience. But I was thinking about how the question of loyalty, right, is always a trap. And I think that's what the book teaches and what your kind of explication of the book shows. And
thank you for saying that, because the loyalty thing is always, if anything else, the point here is that loyalty for Japanese Americans in World War II was not a binary question, and it always gets reduced in classrooms to yes, yes, no, no, pro Japan, pro America, good guy, bad guy, and the novel complicates that because the experience was complicated.
Mhm.
It was the government dividing our community. It wasn't just the veterans against the Nisei, against the resistors, and vice versa. It was the government issuing arbitrary administrative orders to implement the president's executive order, and everyone bumbling through from the WRA to the army to implement these orders, and um, and it was not, again, not loyalty or disloyalty. It was between whether to cooperate with your own incarceration and fight in the army of your nation against a common enemy, granted, or to resist your imprisonment and fight for your personal integrity and your rights as a citizen. And that's what I think the genius of Okada's novel is. He gets at that complication through a character who is an unreliable narrator, who cannot articulate. He doesn't mention the word constitution once in the novel, so it's not didactic that way. Uh, um, but it clearly is a man who's trying to fight his way through to an understanding of where he's at. What is the place of Japanese Americans in America? 2 years after the end of the war, after they had been branded as disloyal, both disloyal enough to be incarcerated en masse without a hearing or trial, but also a subsection of them who were doubly disloyal because they had answered 2 questions on a questionnaire with a no, and that not knowing, no one knowing, not even the camp directors, no one knowing the consequences or the implications of those answers, which the War Relocation Authority uh, uh, used to segregate those who answered no uh, into out of Minidoka, out of Manzanar, into the Tule Lake Segregation Center, which Barbara Takei now calls our worst concentration camp, America's worst concentration camp, because it was a prison camp. It's a whole another story. This is a good time as any, Vince, to make the disclaimer that No No Boy the novel is mistitled. Ichiro Yamada is not a so-called no-no boy. There were 2 different groups. Ichiro is a draft resistor who spent 2 years in a federal prison for refusing his pre-induction physical from inside a concentration camp. The no-no boys were 12,000 men who, as I said, answered no on this questionnaire and were segregated to the Tule Lake Segregation Center. They were not imprisoned in a federal prison. They were just held in camp. 2 different groups. Okada, for whatever reason, no one knows why, whether the publisher assigned the title to the book, because I found no evidence that John Okada actually had a manuscript named No No Boy. So it could have been the publisher, or he could have heard it and said, "Oh, it's a very catchy title, right? No No Boy." But all the introductions to the novel actually get this wrong. Ichiro was not a No No Boy. So that's the short answer to any questions that people may have about that.
Yeah, but I think another thing which I think you were sort of pointing out earlier, right, is sort of in the kind of chaos of the incarceration and of a giant bureaucracy responding to it, right?
Mm-hmm.
A lot of the policies are inconsistent, right? And so you were called a no boy even if you were a yes no or a no yes, right? There's all kinds of shenanigans essentially that happen with a lot of the stuff, and there are other folks who actually answered wrong and somehow their paperwork gets lost, right? So it's but I wanted to actually get to something about Tule Lake, right? Which I think might sort of bring things back more to the present, right? So because there are consequences to this sort of question of loyalty, right? So the no matter how you answer the question of loyalty, you are upholding the logic of the incarceration, right? The logic of the incarceration is not that something you did makes you guilty. It's who you are makes you suspect, right? And you can be punished for being suspect, right? It means that you are called on to answer in ways that others are not. If you're guilty, there's another camp, right? There's another consequence beyond this. And so the choices that people make in answering that question might be incredibly brave, whatever it is, but none of them can actually ultimately get to that, right? And so the book is a kind of waking up to the trap, right?
Yes.
And in that sense, this is the kind of logic that you see applied to all kinds of folks today, right? You see, I think, even more extreme version of this that many Black people face from the police every day, right?
Absolutely.
And so I guess that's a very long way to get to a very simple question, I guess, which is, if you think about Ichiro waking up in 2020, right, what looks familiar to him?
Oh my God. I can't. Oh, I mean, Ichiro would be what? He'd be 85, 90 years old right now. So, but what the 25-year-old Ichiro would be waking up to, it's this history is only useful is useful to us now in the choices people are facing now, seeking asylum at the southern border, whether the children, the DACA children, and to any other group in America today, unfortunately, who that is now or will be targeted on the basis of their race, religion, or immigration status. And so the kind of administrative mishaps and consequences of answering, whatever you do, don't sign anything. I mean, there's maybe one lesson. And the other, I think, is collaboration within your own community. That Ichiro and John Okada does not hit on JACL by name, but there is a sense throughout the novel that there is this party line, this narrative in the community that to have volunteered or be drafted was a patriotic, the right thing to do. And if you didn't do that, you were bad. You were a no-no boy, and you deserved to be spat upon by the Eto Benatos of the world, and that you accepted that you deserved to be spat upon. Ichiro, beats himself like crazy because he believes that this is he deserves it because he told the judge no, he wouldn't be drafted. So yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. These choices that we face today, um, beware of those in your community who would say, as our presidential candidate Andrew Yang did famously earlier this year. Was it earlier this year? My God, that Chinese Americans, Asian Americans need to in the COVID crisis to combat Kung flu and China virus attacks. We need to, as Andrew Yang said and was quickly knocked down for in social media, we need to prove ourselves and to to be better Americans, and we need to, which is of course the better Americans in a greater America was the slogan of the Japanese American Citizen League World War II. So there is that lesson for Ichiro to wake up to today. We have some questions. Leslie Mark. Go ahead. I'll take one. Leslie Mark says, "How did the community in Seattle respond to this book?" We don't know. Oh, we do know. Leslie, the Japanese American, the American public as a whole, but the Japanese American community in particular, ignored the book. I mean, it really just came out. Bill Hosokawa gave a very kind review in the Pacific Citizen, contrary to what my friend Frank Chin has written. Bill Hosokawa thought, here could be the guy who could write the great Nisei novel. Parentheses, if only he hadn't chosen a distasteful topic like the No-No Boys, But no, there was very little reaction publicly in the community, except for like I think John's family members felt a little, got some criticism from neighbors and friends for the profanity. It was the profanity in the book, the cussing that John's wife felt uncomfortable about because her friends mentioned it to her. And I think that John's brother heard some of that too. So, but beyond that, there was no outcry or support either way. Grace Torrey in New York.
Can I?
Yes, Vince.
I was just going to add to that in the book from Ida Press, the John Okada book, there's also a great article by Greg Robinson, if I'm remembering correctly, right, that talks about the really extensive literary community that existed before the war and how it kind of got wiped out. by the war, right? And so what for many years a lot of us, a lot of scholars thought of as the Japanese American community rejecting the book was also about the sort of infrastructure for people kind of sharing, getting excited about literary work by a Nisei author had been wiped out. And so that was something I was really excited to see in your book, Frank.
Right, Greg Robinson called it the devastated landscape
Yeah.
post-war, and
Yeah.
you're right. The incarceration took away the audience. There was no audience for works like Nono Boy, much less for short stories by Hisai Yamamoto and Toshio Mori. They kept writing, but there was no audience there was no community and no audience. You're absolutely right.
But let's get to Grace's question. So I think it's sort of generally about solidarity, particularly about the relationship between Japanese Americans and Chinese Americans during the war, right? And that the sense of regret that so many express now about one group not standing up for another group. Although certainly the politics between the different ethnic groups are very complicated at the time. Do you want to say more about that?
No. I mean, I've married 2 Chinese American women, and both times it was like I had to get past the parents' qualms about my being Japanese and what the Japanese did to China in World War II. There's that history. For those who don't know, after Pearl Harbor, a lot of Chinese Americans wore buttons. Can't blame them. I mean, well, I am Chinese to distinguish themselves from being the Japanese enemy. So that was one thing. But Nono Boy, Grace, your question about Nono Boy itself, Okada takes a very open view of all races in the novel, and there are a number of African American characters called Negroes in the novel, and John treats them all as being, characters in this landscape of an America in which none of them had any power. Everyone was victims of greater forces, not the war, but also American racism. And so the so-called Negroes in the book are seen as persecuted. What's the phrase he used? Persecution in the voice of the persecuted.
In the drawl, maybe.
In the drawl of the Negroes who are calling Ichiro racial slurs on Jackson Street. But also, I mean, he treats the Jim Eng, the owner of the Club Oriental, just as another. They're all friends. They're all part of the same community. And John grew up with a lot of Chinese Americans in Seattle at Billy Gatzer's, so there was that kinship there.
Actually, before we get to another question from Ken Mochizuki, got to get to that question. I did want to just follow up a little bit because we were talking before about that scene with the the kind of conflict between Ichiro and Black folks on Jackson Street. And so, what is
Tokyo? For those who don't know, Jap Boy Tokyo. Go back to Tokyo, and these are the African American workers who came up from the South during World War II to work in the Boeing factory, in the defense industry, taking the place of of everyone who had left for the war, both Japanese Americans and white veterans, and for Ichiro's sense of displacement to come back to Jackson Street after 2 years in camp, 2 years in prison, and finding what he calls Negroes on Jackson, calling him names, was very unsettling for him. But that was Okada's way of showing the demographic shift in Seattle after the war.
No, I think it's really it's really fascinating to think that in that moment, what you were telling me before, right? Those are newcomers, right? And so that is the basis of a community that over the next generation, right, would develop much stronger ties between different kind of racial and ethnic groups in South Seattle. And there's a long kind of history of the sort of interconnected relationships between the different groups that gets lost, I think. But we have a question from another great Seattle writer, Ken Mochizuki, who says, reading Nono Boy began my career as a writer, right? Other than doing a book about Okada, how did Nono Boy influence what you'd later do, right? And how it influenced you, I think, and how it influenced a whole cohort of folks like you.
Yeah, I mean, my experience is like yours, Ken. I mean, I was fortunate to be, at the epicenter of Asian American literature in San Francisco. So I was I pointed out, in a position to be, the photographic model for the cover of the paperback edition, and to work with Frank and Lawson and Jeff and Sean. And I even to answer your question, Ken, I mean, I wanted to find a way to adapt Okada for the stage. Even back in '74, I adapted Ichiro's opening monologue with his mother. No, I'm not your son. No, not Japanese. No, I'm not American. I tried to use it as a monologue, as an audition piece, and I couldn't quite crack it. I couldn't quite nail it. So, plus I was a very terrible actor, but from the very start, just Okada's integrity is what has, for better or worse, led me to the path I've been on since then. He's a good example.
So we have a bunch of questions here. So the question asks about the military, right?
Yes.
So there's seeming sanctity to U.S. military members and veterans today, and by extension, the military itself. How do we demand the ability to critique the military, especially when they're used versus citizens? And it says, P.S. I am a veteran.
What do you think?
And so this again, the complicated, ongoing wounds in the community that this book kind of prods at sometimes. So I'm sure you've had to deal with that in the past.
Well, I mean, sure. I mean, thanking veterans for their service, has become a bit of a cliche in social media, of course. And I mean, those who serve are to be thanked and commended, just as they were during World War II. The only comment I have on that is that for the Japanese American experience was one where our military service was used by our community leaders. It was promoted by our community leaders, by a guy named Mike Masaoka, the JSCL, as a means of purchasing the post-war acceptance of their children, my generation, in a post-war America by proving their loyalty to America by spilling their blood on the battlefield. I mean, Masaoka used those terms that crudely, spilling our blood for America. So, I mean, it was not only patriotic; it had a kind of a 200% patriotism to it, and it was against that backdrop, the sanctity of the military that you described, that a character like Ichiro Yamada and the other 300 draft resistors from all 10 camps faced in trying to explain to their employers, their neighbors, their children what they had done and why they had done it. I made a film, as you know, called Conscience of the Constitution about the Hard Mountain draft resistors. And not only did it have the benefit of kind of opening the door, reestablishing, recovering the history of the draft resistors in our American culture now, but it helped the children of Mitsu Koshiyama and James Omura and others to understand what their fathers did, because their fathers not only didn't talk about camp for their kids, they didn't talk about being in prison for 2 years to their kids. Omura's children were shocked and a little bit hurt and felt betrayed that he had never told them that he had been married before the war and had gone to prison and had stood trial for conspiracy to counsel draft evasion, even though he was acquitted. And then not until that Omura didn't tell them until they were adults. So the film helped frame their story as that of principled civil disobedience in the American 20th century in a way that they could understand. And I mean, that was why we did it. We spent 10 years doing it. We did it so that there would be a context, a framework for people, or for us today, and the children of these guys to understand not only the camps, but also the military, but also the draft resistance and why the draft resistance was what it was.
Can I piggyback on that? Because one thing that you learn a lot about in your book, right? That some people might not know so much about, right, is Jimakutsu, right? Hajime Jimakutsu, right? And I wonder if you want to say a little bit more about how his life and his perspective differed from that of the character Ichiro.
Well, I mean, they were very close. I mean, Jimakutsu, as I pointed out, was the model for Ichiro Yamada. Jim Akutsu's mother did. She did believe that ships were coming to rescue them. She'd been told that by her friends here in the international district. Okada's mother was not like that at all, by the way. And Jim's mother did in fact, take her own life. So I mean, but Jim, the difference, Vince, here's the difference.
Yeah.
If Frank Abe will say this, and Jim Okutsu will say this too, if some guy came up to me and called me a a draft dodger and spit on me, I'd rear back and I'd punch him in the face and I'd
Yeah.
punch him out because they were both tough guys.
Right.
And my friend Martha, our friend, not Martha Nakagawa, objects to the portrayal of Ichiro Yamada in the novel Nono Boy as being self-doubting, taking the abuse, and questioning himself. Whereas the real life draft resistors wouldn't take that stuff from
Yeah.
anybody. So that's the key difference. Since you mentioned it, Vince, Tomiko and I and others will be dramatizing the Jim Okutsu story in a graphic novel that'll come out hopefully next February from Chin Music Press called We Hereby Refuse: Japanese American Resistance to Wartime Incarceration.
Yeah. Tomiko Nomura, I think, is out there.
Yes.
Hi, Tomiko. I have another question here, which is, I think, well, let me introduce it by saying that, one thing that's so striking about the book and hard to understand, right, is how many people try to welcome Ichiro back and how resistant he is, right?
Right.
And, there's, having taught the book, right, you see all different kinds of interpretations of that, right? Is that supposed to make you feel encouraged, or is there something troubling, right? And so the question from here is, can you sorry, let me read this. Can you expand on Okada's take on the employer that finally hires him? I've always found this dark and reflected in my own career, where allies who know Asians, quote, get me.
Where allies who know Asians get me. I don't get that last
think
part.
the way I'm understanding this question, right, is maybe about, how do you feel about all these folks, especially these kind of, these very generous liberal white men after the war, saying, everybody is saying to Ichiro, right? They're not, all the people are saying to Ichiro, please come back, we'll welcome you back, and he says, I'm not into it.
And this woman, Emmy, says to him, if you want it, we can have something together. I accept you for who you are. And he goes, so what do you think, Vince?
Yeah, I don't know. I think that there is it's certainly very easy to read this as something that is sort of flattering to a kind of liberalism that comes about after the war. But there's also a sense of horror behind it, right? And I remember teaching this at the same time as teaching another class with a bunch of horror novels and horror movies, and you start seeing, hear the horror movie music behind everything, right? And you see, well, actually, and this is where Ichiro is somebody who's very exceptional as a literary character, and not just a depiction of your typical draft resistor, right? There's something in him that says, I'm not, I can't say yes to that, right? And that's really interesting. So
yeah, I think what it is, Vince, is that he wants to be accepted back into American society, but it has to be on his own terms. It has to be a very specific understanding. And the problem is, even Ichiro does not know what his terms are. He cannot articulate it, and he can't say, I accept your job offer, but it feels a little awkward because I know you're offering it to me because you feel sorry for me, and you don't really understand my story, and I need you to understand. But at the time, and in 1946, but even in 1957, when John Okada was writing this novel, this was the era of the quiet Americans. This is my parents' generation, the Nisei, and even then, Okada could not see where the place was for Japanese Americans in a white monoculture. I like to say that it wasn't until we took on the redress movement in the 70s, 20 years later, in 78, John Okada he knew there was something out there, as he called it on the last page, somewhere out there. Ichiro could see it, a glimmer of hope. Was that it? A glimmer of hope. The glimmer of hope was redress. The glimmer of hope was, the Sansei generation growing up into adulthood and perhaps, picking up the mantle for not vindication, but justice, for understanding, for explaining their story in a way that Ichiro could find comfortable to accept. because he didn't want white liberal guilt. You're right. I mean, that's why, and which is what the employer came to him with. I mean, Okada makes it, I think, pretty clear that it's coming from a place of guilt and terrible thing you guys went through. I understand what you went through. I hope you come work for me. And Ichiro wants to, but there's something stopping him, and it's that personal integrity of his that stops him from doing that. It's stupid, but it is. and which is why I was glad that here in Seattle we could kickstart the redress campaign with the first day of remembrance, and kind of provide that closure that Okada was looking for.
Did you can you say anything more about Okada's life beyond and afterward? Right, so you discovered all kinds of things about his life that aren't really told, because as you mentioned before, or I think you kind of implied before, people tend to conflate the book with him, right? And his life is quite different. But his experience in that post-war world was quite interesting.
Yeah, this is the book. I'll just put the cover up there. I'll have to look through it to find out what he did. Okada was not a resistor, but clearly, even though he served in the MIS and was a veteran, he felt it. I mean, he felt it, and even though he didn't get the character of Ichiro right, I mean, Ichiro was self-doubting, where Okutsu was a bantam rooster, kind of a cocky little fighter, and Frank Abe was a judo master. He could put himself into the shoes and imagine himself as this character. Okada would go on to work as a librarian here in Seattle, downtown Central Library, fourth floor reference library. Got a better job in Detroit, moved there as a reference librarian where he wrote the novel. Came back to Fullerton to work in the aerospace industry as a technical writer, but Okada really wanted to be an ad man. He wanted to be a Nisei madman, and he succeeded. He got a job at the UCLA library and left it because he couldn't stand charging overdue fines for college students. And he got a job with several downtown LA ad agencies, writing ads for Procter & Gamble products, Crest toothpaste, Gleam toothpaste, and Tide detergent were some of the products at the time. So he was a Nisei madman, and his Dorothy says that's what he really wanted to do, was to write advertising copy. Go figure.
So we have another question out here from Grace again. Hi, Grace. That is another one of those kind of what if questions, right? Thinking about that world beyond. So I don't know.
Oh, should I ask the question? Yeah, Luchu and John Okada met. In my mind, in your mind, in all our minds, they have met because they're conflated in our minds with the introduction to the first IE, where Frank and Lawson and Jeff and Sean introduced us, recovered these novelists and reprinted their chapters in IE, and in our minds, those two are among the foundations of Asian American literature. They were also the only books that Frank and Lawson had at the time to be teaching, because there was so little Asian American literature at the time that was decent. So they're at the start, and if they had met, sure, they would have a lot to say, because they both write in a earthy, somewhat coarse at times language, dealing with frank sexual issues and characters who are pariahs within a pariah race, as Ichiro is, and as character in Eatable Tea is. So one more question, no pressure. How did New York City influence Okada and Nono Boy? Well, I thought about that because John Okada, we have one little scrap of paper that indicates that John Okada may have started a first draft of Nono Boy, part of it at least, when he was at Columbia University getting a degree in a postgraduate degree in education. And it may have been there in my imagination that he saw Madison Avenue types and maybe got the idea for advertising as a career at that time. Vince?
Yeah. So I think your video is frozen. So can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So yeah, you have a question about the context of publication and reception, which is a really big question. We talked a little bit about the kind of early reception of the book. So maybe I'll take the prerogative to give a little twist to this question and ask. The book has been really kind of, the response to the book in the last couple of years has been huge, right? So it's had a long life since it was rediscovered in the 70s, but it gets rediscovered for different reasons. And I'm kind of curious what your experience has been going around the country talking to people about this, right? What do you think is getting people excited about this book now?
I haven't had any strong feelings about that. I mean, I know that Sean in the 70s felt it spoke to him as as we were all subject to the draft in the Vietnam War era, that clearly the question of being drafted as a young man, you know, was something that affected us all, and so we could relate to it just on that level of story. I think that even today, young people, who who question, a young person, a young African American kid who questions why is he being attacked for jogging through a white neighborhood when, for a simple act like that, when other people can jog through a neighborhood, or why are they being why are police being called on them? Have this, can identify with the character who feels to be an outsider. Ichiro is an outsider, and he's always questioning his place in this world that he doesn't quite understand. Because Ichiro is a little bit like Urashima Taro in Japanese folklore. He's a Rip Van Winkle character who goes away and comes back to a world that's changed, and he's still the same. So I think that there are many parallels that can be drawn that way.
Yeah, I think I think one thing about the book for me now is that it's a book about waking up, right? It's a book about sort of waking up and realizing something that Steve Samita, retired professor from University of Washington, talks a lot about how this book it demonstrates how the experience of punishment makes you go searching for guilt within yourself, right? And that in this book is kind of about waking up to the fact that that there's nothing there, right? That actually that natural kind of impulse to being punished when you did nothing wrong, right, is something that plays tricks with your head, right? And so waking up to the fact, like, wait a minute, right? I really understand something is wrong here. I think that is something that maybe resonates with all kinds of people who just in the last a couple months have suddenly started seeing things about their world that they hadn't seen before.
But to answer Miku's question, that at the time in the 70s, it was a critical building block in the establishment of Asian American studies, just as a field, because with the Louis Chu book and with the E anthology, that was where it all began for a lot of students like us.
We just have a little bit of time left, so I don't know if there's another question. I just add to that last point, right? That this was absolutely a staple of Asian American literature classes for for a generation, right? And what's interesting, I think, now is that it's developed kind of life of its own outside of the field, right? So I actually think that there's more exciting things happening. People talking about Nono Boy outside of college classes than there is inside them. As somebody who is inside them sometimes.
Let me get to Tom Kurohawa's question last.
Sure.
The psychology. What's the psychology of the AJA's long-held antagonism of those who identified as no-no? Well, Tom, you're Japanese American, so you know that the veterans who came back after the war blamed the draft resistors and no-no segregees at Tule Lake for ruining things for them. That a lot of their buddies died over in the battlefields of France, Italy. And they thought that this service would purchase them a place in a post-war America. Come back, and they find the same goddamn discrimination against Japanese and Asians as they left. So there was that, which is well articulated in the novel. The other thing is the very specific incident. 1946 JACL National Convention in Denver, Colorado. We have one page of this in our graphic novel. I'm very excited about this part. JACL members, and Bill Sakawa describes this in his book. I got this from a JACL book. Some members wanted to pass a resolution in the first post-war convention of the JACL, Denver, Colorado, hosted by Min Yasui, Mike Masaoka, others. They wanted to pass a resolution to brand all Tertullians with ID cards and opposing their court cases to get their citizenship back. But mostly they wanted ex-Tertullians to carry ID cards in their wallet to say, I'm from Tule Lake, and before I can get a job, you have to know I wasn't Tule Lake, which means I answered no on the loyalty questionnaire. This is JCL. Fortunately, Mike Masaoka had the the bigness of heart to say, well, we shouldn't do that because it'll have the unintended consequence of forcing JCL members to have to produce their ID to prove that they weren't at Tule Lake, they weren't No Boys, and so that could be a little embarrassing. So let's not do that. And that was presented in his book as being like a good thing on Mike's part. So there's actually a point where this antagonism against those identified No Boys started. There's a very specific place.
Yeah. What do you think the important moments have been in moving beyond that?
Oh,
you think we're past it yet?
If you're trying to get me to say that it was important that the JACL apologized to the draft resistors in 2000, May 2000, and if you're trying to get me to say that it was important that JACL finally apologized for its actions toward the Tule Lake segregees just last August in Salt Lake City, I will say this, that Frank Abe thought it was nice, but it didn't matter to him really. I feel the same way. And Frank Abe went on to say in front of the JACL, in accepting this apology from JACL, it was an apology. I shouldn't put quotation, no air quotes around that. Sorry, it was an apology. Frank Abe said, but I think JACL should go further. I really think JACL should apologize to the entire Japanese American community for its policy of cooperation and collaboration with the government in incarceration, and for informing on the Nisei and leading to many arrests and the breakups of many families, and for ostracizing the resistors and the Tulians. So, I think that's where my answer is.
Well, let me just quickly then to the end of the book, right? And I always think of Steve Sumida again in his reading at the end of the book, right? Yeah. Is that the book ends with the resistor comforting the veteran, right?
Oh yeah.
It's not about apologizing to the resistors and the No Boys so much as it's about the need of the entire community to heal in some way, and that is actually sort of through through that position, right? The position of the resistor rather than an apology to them.
Well, Vince, I'm sorry. You used the word heal. I'm triggered. I'm always triggered by the word heal. Sorry. Because people ask me about healing, reconciliation, and I guess it's just me, but those aren't the real issues in my mind. I mean, I think just understanding, having the, what Okada wanted to accomplish, what Ichiro wanted to accomplish, having people understand the complexity of the position they were put into in resisting the draft or answering no on the questionnaire, being segregated in an American prison camp at Tule Lake. Having those things understood is the important point, not an easy forgiveness, reconciliation, kumbaya moment. So forgive me for not being accommodating that way, but I can't go there.
No, that's great. That's great. I want to ask you 5 more questions about that, but this has been a really excellent discussion, and I really appreciate your being here, and I'm so excited that we could do this through Tadaima, and so excited to have
96 people watching, Vince.
Yeah, 96 people watching.
So thank you all very much. Thank you all. Hello to Masumi Izumi in Japan. Thank you for watching. Thanks to David Goldstein in Seward Park for watching. We got to catch up sometime. Vince, you're on Beacon Hill, right? and I'm in Mount Baker, so we're like 2 miles apart. But it feels like miles. I mean, a big distance. But through the miracle of StreamYard, we're all brought together in one space. So thank you all for putting up with us for an hour.
Thank you.
And feel free to ask any questions anytime online.